everyone dhe mirë se vini në Kallëzo për një me. Kosova nuk ka muze të artit bashkohor, qysh e kanë shumica e kryeqyteteve. Ka fillu një iniciativë me mendu se si kishim mujt me e bo këtë muze. Në këtë epokë që po jetojnë, kur dënë me bo një muze të ri, rendi është me pyet edhe njerëzit e qati vendi se qysh kishin dasht komuniteti apo qaj shtet me pa një muze të tillë. Si duhet mu dukaj muze për me ju përshtat të gjithë neve që jetojmë Kosovë, por edhe atyne që e vizitojmë Kosovën. Apo kallëzon përvoja anë mban botës që gjithë një pak e me pak njerëz janë të motivu me i vizitu muzet edhe hapësirat kulturore. Muzet në përbot janë duke përjetu sfida që nëse nuk janë disit të inkuadruar me përvojën digitale, shumë pak vizitor po munden me i tërheq. Në anën tjetër, ata që kanë muzej kanë këto sfida. Po na që s'kemi mjaftu shumë muze, a duhet t'i lojmë anash këto brenga edhe veç të amarojmë e të hapim sa më shumë muze për me kallëzu rëfimin për shtetin tonë të ri. Rëfimin për që mungon të mersi shumë. A duhet me maru muze në ndërtesë ekzistuese? A duhet me bo krejt në ndërtesën e re? Çka duhet me pasaj muze mrena? Në botë po zhvillohet diskutimi se si muzet e së ardhmës ka nevojë me qenë më mikpritës, më të hapun, duhet me qenë hapësira që ftojnë për diskutime shoqërore që përqafohen prej publikut anë mban, duhet me qenë hapësira inkluzive apo gjithëpërfshirëse, edhe duhet me qenë hapësira fleksibile, pra që me mujt me u përdor për disa funksione ndryshme. Jemi tu pa një ndrim të mentalitetit se si është me ndun të kaluarën, çka duhet me qenë muze kur kanë qenë të menume vetëm për konzervim të artefakteve dhe veprave të artit që i shërbejnë atyre që janë deri dikun elita që llogaritën që mirën veshën art, në drejtim të ndoshta duhet me qenë muze me u balancu me pjesën tjerë të popullatës, që kanë me i shërby pjesët tjerë të popullatës, që është shumë ma diverse dhe ka nevoja tjera. Që debat po dojmë me zhvillu pikërisht në qëtë kohë kur po ndodhë diçka jashtëzakonshme në Kosovë. Për herë të parë është Bienalja nomadike e quajtur Manifesta që zhvillohen qytetet ndryshme të botës, është vendos me u majt në Prishtinë edhe ekziston deri në nëntor. Që kjo manifest ka ardhë edhe e ka analizu kryeqytetin e Kosovës e i ka zgjedh dikun 30 lokacione ku ka me ekspozu art bashkohor e shumica prej këtyre lokacioneve s'kanë qenë kur muze, madje, jo veç që s'ka qenë muze. Këto kanë qenë deponit mbeturinave. E mira është që në këtë kohë kur manifesta po zhvillohet në shtetin tonë për herë të parë, kemi mes tjerash për herë të parë jo veç general të NATO-s klasit parë. S'kemi politikan e diplomat ndërkombëtar në shtetin tonë, por kemi kurator të rendit parë botror. Në këtë moment kemi njerëz të artit që kanë ardhur me vizitu Kosovën e që kanë përvojë të hatashme në ndërtimin edhe udhëheqjen e muzeve në shtetet e tyre në Evropë. Janë drejtor të muzeve ndërkombëtare. Ata i kemi ftuar sot sepse janë në Kosovë për me nda përvojën e tyre me ne që me na animu që në Kosovë me bo një muze prej përvojave të ndryshme, një muze funksional. Ata që janë me ne në studio sot dhe që dojmë me na animu me bo një muze më së paku për me i shërby rinisë e këtij vendi edhe në artistëve kogja kualitativ bashkohor që i kemi në Kosovë, me neve në studio janë. Kasper Koning, kurator me përvojë të gjatë edhe ish drejtor i Muzeut të Ludvigut në Kolonjë që i ka animu manifestës me i bo manifestat në vende tjera botnore si St. Petersburgu. Helen Guenin, drejtoresh e Muzeut të Artit Modern dhe Bashkohor në Nice, në Francë. Sofia Hernandez Çonku, drejtoresh e Muzeut të Artit Melli në Rotterdam të Hollandës. Edhe me neve është edhe Yll Rugova, që është kryesues i Këshillit të Muzeut Bashkohor të Kosovës, edhe zëvendës kryesues i bordit manifestës. Yll, me ty kisha nis mas pari. Ku është që ky proces i muzeut të ri bashkohor në Kosovë? Edhe sa ka me zgjatë?
Spari faleminderit shumë për ftesën edhe për mundësinë që me mujt me diskutu në për zakonisht debatet që bëhen politike, me mujt me diskutu për kulturë. Po më duket është një tranzicion shumë me rëndësi, i cili nashta po flet pak edhe për një stad tjetër, për shoqërinë tonë, po shpresoj të paktën. Muzeu i Artit Bashkohor është pikrisht një lloj i etapës në gjithë historinë e artit. Do me thonë, arti bashkëkohor është një etapë në historinë e artit, cilën na nuk e kemi prek shumë këtu mrena në Kosovë në mënyrë institucionale. Na natyrisht kemi shumë artista, cilët janë duke bë karrierë shumë suksesshme ndërkombëtare. Tash po i përmeni vetëm disa emra, por shpresoj që tjerët nuk më idhnohen, është Petrita Lilaj, është Sisli Gjafa, është Flaka Aliti, është Alban Muja, është Jakub Feri, e ka dhe shumë të tjerë, cilët këtu ekspozohen, po kanë shumë pak publik. Ata shumë ma shumë bojnë karrierë në për muze dhe galeri ndërkombëtare, sësa këtu që kanë mundësi të kenë një farë vizibiliteti. Është shumë interesant që unë po besoj, kjo është ndoshta spekulim, që kjo periudha 10 vjeçare, veçanërisht e viteve të 90-ta, kur ne kemi pas shkputje prej institucioneve publike, edhe prej hapësirave publike, ka shkaktu një boshllëk në raportin ton me artin në përgjithësi, por edhe me ndërtesat cilat zakonisht e akomodojnë artin, edhe ajo ka shkaktu që me hup një farë interesimi në këtë fush. Prandaj, tash kjo nuk do të thotë që s'ka fare interesim, këtu ka pas art bashkohor që nga vitet 90 edhe ma herët, edhe ka pas në vazhdimsi. Por ajo ka gjeneru një publik i cili është shumë i ngushtë, dhe më thonë nuk është i gjonë edhe nuk mbrin në gjitha shtresat e shoqënisë, edhe natyrisht që kjo e shkakton problemet e veta, për shembull sot dikush mund të me konsideru elitare, dhe më thonë artin bashkohor si diçka elitar, që i shërbehet vetëm një shtresë të caktuar të njerëzve, e që nuk është e vërtet. Prandaj është shumë e rëndësishme që spari ta përdorim manifestën si platformë, që artin bashkohor me pru të secili banor i Kosovës, secili me pas mundësi me kritiku funi funit, me shiju ata, e pastaj përmes saj nisim të kemi edhe ne koleksionin tonë të artit bashkohor, i cili potencialisht kishtë qenë i përbër nga artistat lokal, nga ajo që ka po prodhon shoqënia jonë sot, por edhe nëse është e mundur të kemi edhe, do me thonë, artist me renome ndërkombëtare. Kjo kishte qenë synimi jonë, por ky muze duhet me qenë në përputhje me çka është, do me thonë, praktika ma e mirë e kohës së sotme. Prandaj, për mua është shumë e rëndësishme që po mundemi me bëni diskutim të tillë me njerëz që kanë veç përvojë shumë të madhe në këtë fushë, edhe që vijnë prej shteteve ku është e etabluar një kulturë edhe për artin bashkëkohor.
Now, Mr. Koenig, I will go to you because you seem in this studio to have the biggest experience of working in not just in modern states like Cologne, but you've worked in St. Petersburg too. So what do you think, how can museums work with complex goals and strategies to embrace new technology in this age and artistic practices, to engage with audiences, especially in places such as Kosovar, where art is not a priority answer to people's needs? What are the key concerns that people should have in mind?
First of all, I have to say I'm an amateur. So I'm not an art historian, and I never finished anything proper. So I don't have a doctorate. I studied anthropology at the New School in New York. And basically, I believe this is a very complex issue, especially at this time where you have many art worlds. You have one which is completely commercial, which is all about money. And even when you talk about artists from Kosovo who are successful, wherever, in New York or in Paris or so, some of them might not necessarily have something to say in relation to the complexity of Kosovo. So interesting art is always universal and local at the same time. You know, it's a dialect, the food. All interesting art has no recipe to become interesting. It's always the exception. When art is really good, it's total exception. So even when you started beginning, a new building or an existing building, and you want to reach a big public, okay, then even good rock musicians, with the exception maybe of the Stones or so, have a big public and they're still vital. But a lot of the music who is very, very popular can be forgotten, but it's very popular. So art basically is a minority issue. And if you want to have both, forget it. So I would play it for an existing building and then involve all the artists and have contradictory opinions, and then something will grow out of it. You don't know in which direction. That's fine. There's always a risk involved. So it's important that the initiative to have a museum is a contradictory term because you think always the past, right? But it would be a creation where something happens which you don't know yet. So sort of you walk up the mountain because you know it's there. But with art, you don't know where it's going to go. So the issue is really interesting. And the history of, for instance, Yugoslavia, there have been enormous accomplishments, you know, very different in Zagreb, in many different, and then this horrible racial, almost fascist situation came about. But now you have archives which deal with Balkan art, which deal with Czechoslovakia and Poland and so on and so on. So the diversity is important. You have to do something which offers something to the world, but it is also local. I mean, this is a very friendly city, interesting, but you can't expect that you have a contribution like as if you're in Paris or in New York or whatever. So the issue is important, but try not to advertise it to the general public because we live in a very pluralistic society. Some people like pornography, other people like cars. So it's the same with art in a way, but art itself, when it is happening, is a minority, basically. So that's my plead.
And to give you a bit more just context, we are a developing country. We are neither too rich nor too poor, but in art, we have invested in culture probably the least percentage of budget in Europe.
Yeah.
So this country has not invested in its culture, and we will have one shot at making a museum, a modern art museum. We will only have one shot. So that's why I want to ask you, considering the background, coming even, Sofia, from Mexico, not a rich country, France, a country that invests incredibly beautifully in telling its artistic history. How can museums rethink and rework collections and consider how mobility of objects, collections in their care would give a deeper understanding of collections and missions to generate interaction with audiences, considering our audiences are, let's just say, are very virgin, let's call these audiences in a sense of have not managed to travel much. This is an isolated country that does not have visa liberalization like the rest of Balkan countries. The youth does not manage to see many museums abroad. How can we interact with these new audiences, and what are the new practices of building these museums in countries with specificities of Kosovo? Maybe I'll go with you, Sofia, first.
Thank you very much, Jetta, for the invitation and for a very important question. I have been actually thinking very much in the last 5 years, I would say specifically, within a trajectory of about 20 years. I did study professionally to work in the arts, both as an artist, art historian, and then eventually focusing on curating. And I've worked in collections, collection-based institutions, but also in non-collecting institutions. And in the last 5 years, with the questions around inclusivity and the rise of minorities demanding also representation within cultural institutions and many types of institutions and not just artistic ones. And with that associated the demands for educational reform. My investigation has really tried to rethink the role of institutions. And with that, the focus that I'm trying to think of now is what does it mean to demodernize our institutions? And by that, I mean, I'm not as interested, I mean, I love and I grew up and I studied through the institution of modernity, the museum being one of them. The author, Tony Bennett, has a very important book called The Birth of the Museum, in which at least we have one history of that type of institution, a collecting institution that is built on creating a better citizen. And a better citizen is one that is both informed and one that is open to mutual understanding. And the Parliament even participated in the fact that the gallery didactics of the displays within the exhibitions had to have information about provenance and not just interpretive works or words about it, but also where are pieces coming from and what does it mean, meaning that information had to be accessible to a larger audience. And that focus of the museum as a space of civic construction or education is one that has been transformed depending on the powers and influences of the countries which have taken the museum modern model to institute it on their own. In the United States, as we know, the debates around the modern museum or inclusivity have to do with the fact that most of the institutions are privately run and they operate as public institutions, and they seem so because they have an educational role, which they've taken very seriously, but ultimately the museums are financed by a group of patrons and philanthropists. It has a long history, such as France with philanthropy, private individuals that together put the funds to create the collections in the museum. In the case of thinking of Kosovo, I think that the questions would be, no doubt that if a city and its artists and communities of stakeholders within the field of culture, because I agree, it's who are the stakeholders that an institution such as a museum would be of relevance. I think that the question is, would this be a museum that looks at heritage, meaning does it have to be a collecting institution? And what are the narratives, or since what are the narratives that wants to be created? Is there a material culture or an artistic production that wants to be gathered? Or is it an institution that is interested in fostering a new kind of heritage for Kosovo? And I think that it's very different, the address or the strategies are very different, because you could also focus on dissonant heritage, meaning the disagreements between the specific cultural legacies that are materialized or visualized within the field of art. I feel that in my questions around the importance of rethinking institutions today, particularly modern institutions that come from a Western perspective, that history is one not only of education or civism, but that come with the white cube, a context of art as autonomous, which, as we know, is not possible. I mean, art is never disinterested, it's all the contrary. The question there is, how do we separate notions around autonomy with the importance of experimentation and artistic freedom, and thinking critically through the arts, which is generally what we are invited to do by artists with the work. So a museum can be anything, and it's just a matter of thinking, what is the mission of this institution? If it is one to produce a critical thinking of the recent years, as we know, post-war art in the Western art historical canon means work that is made after the Second World War. And the canon is such because of a post-war or after the Second World War, a new sensibility or new forms of memory had to be rethought and representation be reconsidered after such tragedy. But is that the post-war art that we're thinking when we're thinking of Kosovo? Or is post-war here 21st century? And if it is the 21st century, then the question is, why take on an institution's modern model if there are so many other tools and examples that you could use to build the 21st century museum that, as you said, is necessarily tied with technology and with forms of accessibility through digital platforms that didn't exist before, but that doesn't ever replace the importance of spatializing knowledge, which an exhibition or a cultural center, a museum can do, and socializing information, which an activity and a social encounter with people because of art. Okay? Because art invites. It invites you to engage. It invites you to see the world so differently. So I think that the beauty of wanting to create a museum now for Kosovo, which is always deserving, and if there's an interest, it's because there's a need, then my suggestion would be to really think of other models that are not necessarily the modern one, but that have to do with our present, our contemporaneity, and the experience of the 21st century as we have it, one that will never be the same after this recent pandemic, and discussion and relevance of acknowledging the minorities that have been rarely represented within history, certainly within the field of visual arts and culture.
First, let me compliment you. It's amazing that in Kosovo we have two directors, women directors of art institutions. And Helen, I would turn to you. You run a modern art institution in France. Is there such institution under pressure to build new ways to talk to new audiences? And is there at all any need to do that if you have, like from outside, when we think of France, people go to France to visit museums, as traditional as they are. If there is any need in that country, is there any pressure in that country to think differently and communicate differently to new audiences?
I don't think it's in terms of pressure, but of course we have to renew ourselves and to rethink how we work, how we are connected to our community, because for me a museum is a public institution, not just in terms of funding, because in France we have this great opportunity to have public funding. There is a tradition there. But we are also a public institution in the way that we are gathering works that belong to anybody. It's not something that is private to the museum. We collect for everybody, for here and now, but also for the future. And we are also a public institution in the way that we have to be an echo chamber of what's happening around them. We cannot be in a kind of ivory tower. This is the old model from the past, or a kind of image that we had from the museum. But a museum is rooted in a community, is rooted in a city, in a territory, and it's not really a single institution, but it's really about being part of an ecosystem. And if you're thinking today about creating a museum, maybe it's great, and I think it's a great opportunity, and I'm completely in line with what Sofia said just before. But maybe it's too much pressure for one single institution, you know. When you run a museum, even if you are really connected and working with all those social debates of today, if you are working or trying to work in an ethical way, or trying to work with the question of sustainability that is so important today, you cannot do that alone. And for an artistic community, it's very important to have different tools and different models and possibilities to accompany an art scene. So not only a museum that will maybe create the kind of, how can I say, heritage or imagination of what is Kosovo today and what it will be tomorrow, but it's important also to accompany the production, to help artists to stay here. If they want to have an international career, that's great, and then maybe they can come back. But at one point, what is necessary is to create a whole ecosystem around the museum. You have already today artist-run spaces and associations that are very active. So they are also super important elements of a whole chain, of an ecosystem of art.
Ulti e për mene e nise hapjen tone me një analizë shumë të mirë, që shumë rol e kanë, po më duket që të problem vene që janë si na që s'kanë që si muze, kanë ma shumë problem që kanë me shti në atë ndërtes, se sa me pas ndërtesën. Ne kemi emna që veç po qmohën shumë në përbot edhe marrin çmime, emna që i përmenet artistave, si Petrina Lila, Flaka Aliti, Recep Feri, Sisle i Gjafa, po na e kemi problemin tjetër ma shumë që mi u kthy që s'muj mi ik. Ku do t'jetë ky vend? Jo, çka do të shtihet në atë vend? E në debatin se ku do t'jetë muzeu i ri bashkohor, është shumë interesant me pa përvojën e manifestës. Edhe po du me të pyet, a jeni në ndikim edhe është eksperiment manifesta, duke pas se çfarë tri prej veneve ma të erta në Prishtinë, nëse muj me zgjedh, që janë Tulltoria, që ka qenë deponi e mbeturinave të ngurta, ajo jo që s'ka qenë vend për art, po deponi ka qenë. Grandi, që ka qenë frikë me hynë të horror, ka qenë film. Hivzi Sulejmani, një nga ndërtesave bibliotek, po ma e vjetra e mundshme të shkatru. Manifesta i ka kap çato i ka bo vene për art. A ekziston mundësia që mundëri me konsideru një vend ekzistus me u bo muze, apo thjesht është ma komplikueshëm me shti këto muze edhe ma letë me bo një muze të ri?
Para se mu përgjigj nështë direkt në lidhje me ndërtesën, kisha dashur veç edhe një plotësim sa i përket historisë së Kosovës në fushën e artit edhe këtë përvojën tonë në koleksionim, sepse megjithatë ajo nuk është inekzistente dhe nështë është mirë me sqaru edhe këtë pjesë, që në Kosovë, qysh në vitin 1937, ka qenë një koleksion i parë i veprave të artit, i cili u quajt Muzeu i Artit Modern.
1937, Muzeu të Artit Modern.
E ka quajt që është koleksionisti, po.
Okay.
Ajo është bo pjesë e koleksionit të Muzeut të Kosovës në vitin 1945, edhe vazhdon sot me met diku në podrumet e Muzeut të Kosovës. Dhe më thonë, ekzistojnë diku ato vepra. Po, kjo nuk është trajtu në vitin 1979, kur Kosova ka vendosur me pas galerinë e vete të arteve, edhe kur e ka themelu këtë, do më thonë, galerinë e arteve, është bo koleksioni i parë tipik i artit modern, i cili ka përfshi periudhën prej vitit 1945 deri në vitin 1979. Edhe në këtë kohë kanë ble 300 veprat e para, e kanë kryu një komision, kanë ble vepra, kryesisht prej rajonit, po në pjesë e koleksionit janë edhe disa vepra, si për shembull Said Fombli, ka diçka të Verhollit, ka diçka të Henry Moore.
E ku janë këto sot?
Këto Galeria Kombëtare i ka të rujtura.
Galeria Kombëtare e Arteve.
Po, Galeria Kombëtare e Arteve, sot i ka rreth 1000 vepra të ndryshme, cilat janë kryesisht lokale dhe rajonale, por edhe ndërkombëtare, do të thonë ka edhe vepra ndërkombëtare. Kështu që nuk është si skemi fare historinë në këtë drejtim. Natyrisht në periudhën osmane ka pas shumë më pak, se ajo ka qenë tjetër lloj e vlerësimit sa i përket artit në atë kohë. Ka qenë arti kryesisht i bazuar, unë nuk jam historian, por këtë pjesë e di, arti i bazuar në objekte fetare, ilustrimet që janë bërë aty, apo në kaligrafi e të ngjashme. Po tash, idea me artin bashkohor është që me kriju një koleksion të ri, i cili kish me qenë për artin bashkohor, pra ato që vjen pas artit modern. Pra një farloj arti që vjen në periudhën postmoderne të zhvillimit shoqëror. Edhe mu po më duket shumë interesant ky diskutimi, a ja vlen me pas koleksion, se nështë është e vërtet që s'kemi nevojë me pas koleksion fare. Po përshtypja jam është që na takon edhe neve si pjesë e shoqërisë njerëzore me lujt rolin ton, i cili është i vështirë, me prezervu këtë pjesë të kulturës së njerëzimit. Qoftë ajo këtu që zhvillohet, apo që zhvillohet ndërkombëtarisht. Kështu që edhe na duhet me lujt rolin tonë dhe detyrën tonë në këtë drejtim. Prandaj, kish qenë mirë që na mi ndjek praktikat më të mira për diçka të tillë. E sa i përket ndërtesës tash, nëse mundemi me kalu aty, Natyrisht, janë disa diskutime që po i bëjmë tash me Këshillin Iniciues për Muzeun e Artit Bashkëkohor, edhe është debat i madh. Një prej mënyrave është që na ta përdorim për shembull një ndërtesë si Grandi, nëse mundemi me diskutu me fondin sovran i cili më duket e menaxhonat ndërtesë, edhe që një pjesë të saj me kthy në Muzeun e Artit Bashkëkohor. Kjo kishte qenë një mënyrë e lehtë edhe e shpejtë. Tjetra është që të bëhet pikrisht te tulltoria e Prishtinës, te ish fabrika e tullave, sepse ajo zonë është një farë nyje lidhse, e cila e lidh Tophanën, Medresën, Kodrën e Trimave dhe Arbërin, kështu që kishte qenë një pikë takimi për krejt këto lagje dhe këtë komunitet, mënyrë që përveç të ketë rol kombëtar, të ketë edhe rol të drejt për drejt në komunitetin përreth. Kjo kishte qenë diçka pozitive. E ka edhe modele tjera, si për shembull me gjetë një tokë diku dhe me ndërtu krejt prej fillimit një ndërtesë. Unë po besoj që nuk i kishte taku Kosovës si na me i shpenzu 200 milion euro për një muze. Unë e di në Bruxelles sot, janë duke bë muzeun Pompidou është në zgjerim, edhe po qenë një deg në Bruxelles, i kushton diku 250 milion euro ai muze. Nuk po besoj që Kosova është dashur me pas diçka të tillë. Na duhet me gjetë një model tonin, i cili reflekton edhe historinë tonë, edhe modelin ton të veprimit. Na megjithatë e kemi një trashëgimi në këtë drejtim, cilin duhemi me kap edhe përmes asaj me mujt me ndërtu një institucion i cili...
Mirë që merren për punën e pareve, se megjithatë edhe nëse sot 250 milion, një muze i ri kushton. A ka Kosova buxhet? A ekziston vullneti politik që qeveri me do buxhet për një art bashkohor që edhe 250 s'është, po as 1 milion s'janë mjaftojnë është ta me bo një muze të ri? A i donë Kosova që ato pare?
Jo, nuk i ndonë, 1 milion i ndonë gjësysh.
1 milion i ndonë gjësysh. Dhe i kur mundet me shku mi do, sama?
Nuk i di, kjo tash mbetet me testu, po unë po besoj që për nema nuk na takon neve me bo diçka të shtrajt. Na vjen me gjetë një model i cili
Ani, çka është diçka e lirë? Çka është lirë për një muze? Ta kenë njerëzit, na e dim, sa kushton një autostradë. Shumë kena folë në që studio në që të Kosovë për ndërtimin e autostradës ma të shtrajt në Evropë, e kemi, për Shqipni. Këtu ka me pas jo tolerancë për ndërtimin e diçkafit të shtrajt në artë. Ama një shifër praktike sa kështë me qenë starti i ndërtimit të
Unë
muzeut.
veç po flas për shembull si krahasim solla koncertale e Filharmonisë kushton diku 15 milionë e gjys. Tash na nuk e dim se kemi bërë ende një analizë të tillë, janë arkitektët të mrena grupit që po punojnë në drejtim, po mundet me u marr si shifër referente. Po mundet me qenë edhe shumë më lirë.
I want to pose a question to you when we talk about taking artistic risks in making a more creative museum than in the past, but at the same time, we're dealing with actually the need, in Kosovo there's a need even to preserve what we have. We have not preserved because we've lived largely under occupation. The battle for a museum is a battle for identity.
Yeah.
To be honest and to have the elephant in the room, Serbia has denied Kosovo's existence also based on the fact these are not civilized people.
Okay.
These are people who don't deserve their state. So this is the
my
need.
advice I agree with him, to be very modest and very ambitious in your goal. So you focus basically on art, and art is something which breathes. Sometimes it's very general, sometimes it's very specific, but it is always minoritarian. It is never with the general public. So for politicians, it is not so easy to plead for art, so to speak, because that's basically most of the people don't care. They don't care. However, if you have an intelligent idea which is internationally effective, don't forget how Manifesta started. When the wall came down, then Europe changed completely. Prague, Budapest, Belgrade. They were not East Europe, they were Central Europe, you see? So especially from a German point of view, it changed the world completely. Also, when you think about institutions, the institutions, let's say in Germany, after the war, till the mid-50s, between the East and the West, that was highly propaganda, you see? there was a kind of, art became very important and it had a symbolic meaning. Like in the fascist era, the Nazis, for 12 years, they shut off the country completely and dictated their very narrow-minded, pompous, stupid art. In Yugoslavia, you had a very different situation in the East. You see, there was a kind of interesting, weird architecture, public sculpture, which was very different between East and West. It had a very particular kind of form. Therefore, to reflect the particularity of the history, when you say 37, 45, 79, that is something which should take, and from there something will grow. But I would not recommend to build a big museum, because this is a problem, that museums, politicians always agree to put money into investments. You have to put a lot of money into the brain of people, into their souls, children. You have to tell them that Marcel Duchamp is more than 100 years old. You see, they have very little idea of what modernism is. When they hear, I don't know, Schoenberg or so, they think it's crazy music, but it's historical. So you have to understand history and you have to understand culture. And let's hope that we in the future have more culture and not less. You see, when you see how many languages have disappeared, how many cultures have disappeared in consumerism, right? So there's this famous quote by Andy Warhol where he says, everywhere in the world, Bombay has a McDonald's and London has a McDonald's, although Peking and Moscow has no McDonald's. So he says, that's not my home. It's not. But now, interesting enough, Moscow doesn't have a McDonald's anymore since, I don't know, half a year or so. So the conflict, I don't believe that art will ever change the world, but it understands, it makes you understand the complexity and contradictions within culture. And if you have a chance to be educated, be in contact with music, with philosophy, with art as a child, it's a fantastic thing to survive. And I think that's the way to do it, not to talk about a new museum with a star architect and so on, and then you have it and you have to fill it. No, it has to grow from the artist's point of view, and then it will grow. And I'm sure all the people who are here now we have in solidarity, you know, with the Kosovo, in solidarity with your particular culture. We don't want to have a unified culture, no. And that's a contribution. Think about an artist like Brancusi. You know, he's very Romanian, and he's probably one of the most significant sculptors in the 20th century. But you cannot separate that.
You opened, Sophia, you opened this subject of educational role of a museum. But as you saw, I'm the experiment on this panel. I was surprised that there was a modern art history museum in 1937. So I'm considered an informed person. I don't know about it. We might end up with a need to form a museum in order to tell the story about us, to just tell the story about art that existed and was made, modern art in this land. Do we risk again on our need for identity, Kosovo's need for identity as a new country? We've built this country mainly politically, not artistically yet. This will be a first time we establish this art project would be the most major art project that has been since the end of the war. Do we risk making our need for identity and heritage more important than the need of presenting art?
I think that I would try to rethink that the urgency lies elsewhere. And I would really focus on what you've just said, identity construction. And I also think that noting the years of the start of a collection and then the pause, that 79, you don't know about it, mostly no one will know, is that what you want to rethink is that you do not want to keep with silences. And what museums do best is that they make visible what has happened, or they make visible what is imagined to make ultimately material. So my thinking is that identity construction has been one of the main outcomes of museums. But if you actually do it as your aim, rather than, meaning if you produce something that has to do with identity construction, what I would first think is, what do you do with the historical lagoon that exists between the acquisition that stopped in 1979 and the present day? It's not that it just stopped because there was no interest or no budget. There were political circumstances why that stopped. It doesn't mean that art production was also stopped. Creativity and culture maintains its production. It's just not visible. So I think that the questions that you have there is, on the one hand, how do you address identity construction today so that the historical lagoon that is represented in the pausing of a collection building from the States and its lack of presentation ever since, or reinterpretation as of now, how can that be the motor or the seeds to form an identity construction project so that, again, it doesn't fall in invisibility, or that it's not silenced, or that is used with euphemisms as the fact that we stopped collecting. No, you didn't stop collecting. There was just a political project that involved a war, right? And a political project that involved resistance, and that in and of itself created a different language, perhaps, that is manifested in other cultural expressions like music and the visual arts or conceptualism, because it had to circulate anywhere. So I think that art history is essential, that artistic production, as you said, is essential as well, because you really have to consider an ecosystem. So both opportunities for professional development, opportunities to access the existing collecting and write a history about it so that people could learn, understanding what is that historical lagoon that must be pictured, that must be represented, and then trying to think how does all this fit within an identity construction to present the project. I just heard over breakfast, I just arrived to Kosovo, and I just heard over breakfast, and I'm sure that you're going to know, is that the average age in Kosovo is 29 years. It's incredible. It's a new country in a way, but it's not a new country that doesn't have a past. It just has a responsibility to create, to make sense of that lagoon, historical lagoon that was filled with struggle. And there are many artists today that are interested not only in developing new museums and a new country, which I think should be done for sure, but also in rethinking how do you address those struggles. Identity construction for Kosovo involves diaspora. It involves immigration, it involves uprooting. It doesn't only involve the struggles lived here and the tensions that remain existing with neighboring countries. It also involves trying to maintain the connections with the diaspora and with the languages that are all over the world because of the wars that have existed here. So that's international.
Yeah.
I have a real problem with that term identity construction, because that means you have an ideological idea to create an identity. And whenever ideologicals or political religions or wanted to construct an idea of how to perceive the world, it always failed. So what's interesting about art, which means comic, photography, design, typography, also traditional art, painting, you see, all this has another identical momentum which cannot be subsumed. It is changing. There are many influences, the manga from Japan, the television, the world which is changing permanently. So we are talking about an art museum, but in an open sense, right? And a very open, because there's a whole chapter of art from the 80s on, which is basically criticizing institutions right? It's sort of institutional critique, but it is within. You see, that there's a very interesting quote of Freud. He says, art and culture are two different things. Culture means women, men, people with money, people with no money, tall, small, and so on and so on. Whereas art is that was in 1890, the enemy of culture, but it exists within culture, which means fork and knife, being polite to each other, accepting foreign people, and being friendly and trying to avoid war. So that's where art can be. That's a kind of idea which I think you are at, which can be very productive.
Helen?
No, I just want to go back to this idea of identity. Maybe we could speak about singularity, because I think that if you have a museum that is a kind of UFO, because it's a political wish to have an international museum as everywhere in the world, and if it's not a necessity, it will not really work. Maybe it will be a touristic attraction. Maybe it will be a tool for development. But I think that today more than ever, the museums need to be anchored in their territory. This does not mean that they have to be enclosed on themselves, not enclosed on an identity, but they have to be rooted. I love the term of seeds, because then, if you start to have the seeds and the roots, then something can grow out of that. And if I can make a parallel with the museum I lead today in Nice, this museum was born precisely because at one point at the dawn of the 60s, there was an incredible artistic scene that bloomed outside of Paris, outside of a capital. And this scene was connected to international artists. And 3 decades after, the city decided to have a museum to pay a tribute to this scene. So going back to a moment and going back to a history of the territory. But this is only the starting point. And from this starting point, we are able to speak locally, we are able to speak about a local adventure, but then to connect it with what happens throughout the world. So we are not fixed in this identity. We are not enclosed in a past history. We are not enclosed in a territory. We are just thinking of how this territory, and even today, is related to an international scale. And I think that this connection between past, now and there, and future, about the local and the international, it's not just words. It's really the essence of what the museums needs to be today.
I also want to just correct the idea that Kosovar needs an identity construction. It actually needs just expressing its identity, because we're talking about a culture that was largely subdued, oppressed, and a little bit self-centered throughout these last 2 decades, trying to please the international community and to project itself how it thought that international community should perceive Kosovar. Në këtë betejë ekziston një yll, do të thonë, na kemi për çka po flet ti është nevojë praktike mas pari, veç që to koleksionet që janë ekzistuese nëpër podrume. I përmene sa po shohun 2 podrume ku ekzistojnë koleksione në Galerinë e Arteve edhe në Muzeun e Kosovës. E neve diç tash debati kryesor që është bo për humbjen e artefakteve që na ka vjedhë Serbia. Në fakt na kena podrume, po më thu, edhe në biseda me këta udhëhesa të institucione, ata thonë jemi kogja plot me hapsin, edhe nuk kemi kushte me i majt, edhe nuk kemi temperatur të duhun, nuk kemi ekspertiz të duhun me i arkivu qëto. Derisa na këtu po folim për diçka nështë shumë luksoze që duhet me prezentu një muzej i artit modern. Qysh i kërcështojnë qëto 2 nevoja? Nevoja jonë, veç me preservu një herë, veç me i rahatu dhe me auhek pluknat qëtëne pjesëve, qëtëne punimeve artistike që i kemi, me nevoja qa duhet me prezentu një muzej.
Që shë tha edhe Sofia ma herët, është shumë interesant që na kemi qenë që shumë të fokusum që me mbrojt kulturën tonë, gjuhën tonë, karshi një agresioni edhe opresioni që është bo, so që tash që nuk e kemi mo qatë agresioni, jemi shliru prej ti, kemi nisë mu shliru edhe na prej nevojës që me rujt ato edhe me mbrojt edhe me konzervu. Kjo nashta mas mirë të mundet me u jep si shambull të Muzeu Kombëtar i Kosovës. Aty janë rreth 50.000 artefakte, cilat janë në podrumin e Muzeut Kombëtar, cilin na prej vitit 1999 nuk i kemi regjistru mo, edhe nuk e dim as çka ka saktësisht. Do të thonë janë 50.000 artefakte. Ndërkohë që na jemi shumë të interesum, edhe kjo është shumë valide.
As nuk e kemi regjistru? Kush na ka nalë me regjistru?
Kush na ka nalë me regjistru, veç kemi haru që duhet me bëhet.
Po.
Na nuk e dim as çka kemi aty.
Tu kajt për artefaktet e Serbisë, na s'kena regjistru çka kena.
Na nuk e dim çka kemi në edhe aty duana me potencuar diçka, koleksioni i familjes Gjinolli, i cili ka qenë i shekullit 18-19, kryesisht armë edhe tesha, ishtë dashur me qenë pjesë e çatij koleksioni, sepse kur u bë në vitin 1945 muzeu, e kanë mbledh edhe koleksionin e familjes Gjinolli. Nuk e dim a është aty, nashta edhe nuk është hup, po duhet me u bo një regjistrim do me thonë çatij koleksioni. Tash,
a je sigur që s'ka kurfar regjistrimit koleksionit Muzeun Kombëtar të Kosovës?
Regjistrim ka para vitit 99, po kur nuk është...
Prej 99?
Prej 99-ës nuk ka, na nuk e dim çka ka aty. Do me thonë, e mos të flasim për digitalizim edhe mënyra moderne, praktika moderne të këtij regjistrimi. E tash, pse është me rëndësi që një muzej t'il me u bo, kur na kemi kaq shumë probleme me koleksionet tona paraprake, është pyetje shumë valide, se nëse na nuk dimi mi mbrojt ato që i kemi pas ma herët, qysh kemi me kriju koleksion tri, unë po besoj që tash është mundësia që me u hap që këtë diskutim, edhe që Muzeu i Artit Bashkohor me shërby si model, i cili mandej kish me u zgjeru edhe të institucionet tjera. Në fakt, Muzeu i Artit Bashkohor edhe diskutimet si që po i bojmë sot, me qenë një lloj apeli që edhe atje me u bo regjistrimi, me u bo një modernizim, me u bo një tejkalim në një stat tjetër të zhvillimit edhe organizimit. Po paralelisht, gjithçysh me ndjek edhe një institucion si Muzeu i Artit Bashkohor.
Më falë, po nolna që tu se une në Kosovë, muj me paramenu që s'kemi restaurus ekspertat arkivave, por njerë që i regjistrojnë, që është, po supozoj, një krymje shkollës fillore të mesme, me shkruj qka ki, që asi njerë që kanë kry juridik, e që kanë kry gjuhë letrare shqipe, që asi ki sa duhbe, që është e mundur me mos me ditë me registru, spjego mave.
Kjo është veç, po mendoj që është çështje kujdesi, nuk ka të bëj me dituri apo njohuri. Ato, secili artefakt, eksponat i cili është i muzeut, e ka një pasaport të vetën, në cilën duhet me ushënu disa dhëna, e cilët me siguri pe panelit tonë e din shumë mirë. Ato ekzistojnë tash, i kanë ata pasaportat, disa për tyne janë zhduk, disa për tyne kanë hup krejt, na nuk e dim çka kemi në atë koleksion.
So, in one sense, over breakfast in your 3-4 days you are here, you can see the energy and the good sides of Kosovo. You talk about the youngest population, but then, the darker side is this is a population with the worst educational results in PISA, served by the worst education system in Europe. Can you, is it unfair to ask Kosovo to take artistic risks as too much of a luxury in a battle that you're fighting, historical neglect?
One doesn't exclude the other. We have to go back to our grandparents and look at how they looked at things. What was considered significant. Rich people had been painted, portrait painted by so on. Some of these painters might be completely irrelevant. However, it tells you very much about an example of bourgeois kind of attitudes. So the question of this discussion talking about the fact that so many works are in the basement, which have been more or less forgotten. Obviously, not all of them are significant, but one has to deal with it. And very much because the question is of a contemporary position, if you say the average age of the population, what, 26 or 27, this is fantastic. You have a responsibility towards the next generation, which is now 10 or 11 years old. So that is building an identity. And for instance, this is so interesting that since 6 years or so I live in Berlin. And quite often you hear, Spanish, you hear English and so on. And the fact that more and more people from other cultures come, as more interesting it becomes. So it is adding complexity to a culture, and therefore you have to look back. But the initiative comes from him, who is dealing with this idea of a contemporary museum, which is an artistic grassroots momentum, right? And I heard today at the press conference, the mayor was very happy and he was very articulate and he was very hopeful. So you have an international audience which comes here out of real sympathy, you see? Not because when are you going to be part of Europe or so on and so on, but because it's an open city, it's a friendly city, and there is an urge. So.
I want to add, I think that it's a very interesting response as well, and I think the same that one doesn't come with the other because the task is huge that you have, but at the same time, how you describe it, at the same time, the beauty of it is that also it allows you to think of the museum as a school. And there are, historically, there are some examples of this. And the objectives of, creating the inventory that hasn't been done in decades, you can't do it in a year. So I think that as long as there is a design of a plan, that even if it takes 10 years to develop, but at least that if there's a roadmap for that inventory to be produced and for that collection to be cared, the Museum of Contemporary Art, if you wish to call it or to think about it, the museum as a school is already contemporary. So it could be a space that already produces or helps diversify the ecosystem that Helen was saying, which is definitely necessary. A museum won't hold, or it won't be of the public if it's not has different doors in which you can involve and engage the public. So definitely artistic experimentation has to take place at the same time that, meaning education at the same time as experimentation. And people learn with art, people become literate with art. When you say we do have an identity, it's a matter of how can we best express it. The museum is the one that provides the tools for articulating emotions and for best expressing that culture or those many identities that we have there. And I think that for me, it's less a question of generation than understanding that the exciting period that you're in is that it's one of construction, it's one of transition, and that a museum is a great hub to make that happen. It's where the ideas get generated and the plans done. And the very diaspora, as I said, the museum can create those channels for a certain expertise that is here, but that needs an update, or for certain expertise that is not here, that has to begin spreading. Those are the channels that you may find with the very language and connections that sadly have been immigrating out, or there's been brain drain, but it will it's a magnet. And I think that those are the things that, or at least you can make it a magnet of,
Yll, kur të pomenoj që ke qenë pjesë e qëtyne dy projekteve cilat me një anë kisha mendu që janë më të vështira mu bo se regjistrimi I artefakteve në podrom. Aplikimi për Manifest ka qenë e pabesueshme që Prishtina e fiton. Para 3-4 vjetëve ki nis u realizu sot. Sofia po flet që është një kohë e gjatë që duhet me investu këtë art modern. Një 10 vjet para menoni që është projekta fa gjatë dekador. Ti do më thënë, ke pas durimin para 3-4 vjetëve me menu për me apliku për manifesti drejtori kulturës, kur ke qenë Komunë e Prishtinës, sot për realizohet. Burgun e Prishtinës je dashur me kalu në byrokraci shtetënore për me zyrtarizu në Parlamentin e Kosovës, në qeverin, me marrë vendime që me u bo burgu mos mu bo një qendër tregtare, po me met burgu Prishtinës, u qel këtë verë, që ishe këto. Qëto 2 projekte, qëka të kanë mësu, që mund është me thonë nështa që ky projekti artit modern, edhe regjistrimi që të në shembulli i regjistrimit të artefakteve, Bovakis ka me dështu. Qëka të kemë supi që të në 2 projekteve?
Nashta pyetja është edhe pse nuk është bo ma herët që ky regjistrimi, edhe unë kur e kom pas mundësin me bo ato, pse nuk e kom bo, nashta edhe që ajo...
E kur e ke pas mundësin, në kohë shkurt që ishe po menon zëvendës Ministri i Kulturës?
Po,
disa muaj, sa ke qenë?
3 muaj kom qenë, nuk besoj që
ka mujt. Nështë ta falim që për 3 muaj të shemë.
E që ato nëse bërë me ma falë.
Nështë ta falim.
Jo, po du me thonë nështë që veç ajo është edhe një proces sensitiv, se aty ka disa për artefakteve që janë arkeologjike shumë të vjetra, edhe që kanë vlerë të madhe, edhe natyrisht që ka sensitivitet. Ajo është teknikisht e letë mu bo, po në anën tjetër vynë me pas një farë procesi cili e garanton që ato artefakte kanë murujt edhe nuk kanë mu tjetërsu.
Po dhe Burgu Prishtinës nuk ka që sështë sensitiv. Aty është projekt këgja politik edhe sensitiv edhe u realizu.
Po e ka një sensitivitet tjetër, se aty storjen kërkush nuk mundet me marrë me shtin gjep edhe me shku me shit në tregun e zi. Që kjo është përparësia në shta.
Po, veçi, në mos regjistrimi, nënkupton që dikush ka mujt me kap një artefakt me shtin gjep edhe me shku me shitën në treg zi.
Unë e kam frikë që ajo veç ka ndodhë, edhe që ka plot artefakte aty që kanë mujt më shduk, po kjo është veç spekulim, nuk di që ka fakte, po është mirë me u verifiku. Soj përket...
E qysh kena me verifiku nëse kur se registru?
Duhet me janë sa ma shpejt që i proces, duhet me apelu që ta është sot, që sa ma shpejt me njësë i proces, që na me kuptu që ka krejt aty, qysh në qëfar gjendje janë ato artefakte, edhe do më thonë, qysh mujmë mi konservu edhe ma mirë nësë është nevojë.
Okay. Po for the end, I want you to answer the question of your experience of the museum you see that are rethinking the museums of tomorrow. What are examples in the world? I want to get out of Kosovo for the end of the program. Use our imagination. Which are the museums that you have seen that have impressed you in the way they're putting out a story out there? Let's forget Kosovar for 10 minutes.
So, I was thinking of a quote of one of my favorite comedians from Bavaria. And he was very popular in the 20s, and intellectuals like Bert Brecht and others wanted to have a closeness to him. He was a really popular comedian, and he was not allowed to perform during the Nazi time. And there's a quote which comes over back and back and back, and it says, Kunst ist sehr schön, aber macht sehr viel Arbeit. Art is very beautiful, but takes a lot of work. And I think that it is on part of the artists as those who are committed to a public. So a museum is public, but it's very good to have a point of view. And there are some institutions who manage to do this, and then they fall back, and then they are reborn, maybe. It's very important to have an atmosphere of freeness, of not pressure. So our job cannot be an aesthetic policeman. It has to be open. But it has to be so open and so spiritual that some people who want to have big success don't go close to it. Because now the art world has become toxic. It is so consumerist on such a high level that you hear on evening news another painting of Wall was sold for 30 million and so on, which doesn't mean that Wall isn't significant. However, it takes a completely different field. The oligarchs and all these rich people, there's so much money around, so there's a lot of art. There's an inflation of art. So therefore, I plead for something which is very specific and at the same time global. but you cannot tell how it's going to be in 10, 20, or 30 years. So the most important exhibitions in the 20th century, they were all initiated by artists. And now everything has become professionalized. And you have now even advisors for politicians, what to dress and how to speak, and the same thing goes for art. So it's significant. It's like your museum, right? It's very connected to Nouveau Realism, Yves Klein, and so on and so on. To go back to the roots and make a small plant and then take care of it. And there's no example. You cannot, this is an interesting thing about art. Art is not ideology. You cannot say, here is Di Chirico. I mean, he was probably one of the most modern painters, but he repeated himself, but he never became a reactionary, right? So there are so many examples which are not the rule, it's the exception. And that same thing goes with the play, things like this. So his initiative, when he talks, I don't even know the story of the prison, but it's also important. The kindergarten is as important in how people are being treated in a prison or in a psychiatric ward. That's civilized. And art can help you to understand contradictions. It's very, very consolidating for children. And our best audience are old people, old-age people like me who have a lot of time, or children. Yeah. So.
What are museums that impress you today, Sofia?
I was thinking, I love museums. I'm going to mention one typology and then one museum. I think that one museum that has been constantly inspiring has been, because of its exhibitions and because of its collection, is the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid. And I think that museum, the Guernica, is there. Very controversial of how it's moved to different museums, but for me, that museum, I always learn something. I'm always in awe. There's always something that leaves me wondrous. I mean, when you see the Picasso's Guernica, your eyes are like moving, to make the picture. I always learn, and it has to do with the architecture, the collection. It has to do with the vision of Manolo Borja, the director of that museum, for quite some time, who's a brilliant mind. So yes, so to me, this is a museum that is inspiring. And then there's a typology of museum that typically emerges from the private sector. There's many of them, particularly with contemporary art and modern art, and they're everywhere in the world, but that I love. And that I don't think should necessarily just emerge from the private sector, from private collectors that have a very public interest, meaning it's not the oligarchs, it's people that, collectors that have had a social inclination. And it's a typology of the sculpture park. So the Kröller-Müller Museum in the Netherlands, the De Menil collection which is not sculpture park, but the Menil collection in Houston of housing, and then the Inchotim Botanical Garden and Museum in Brazil. And what the three of them have in common, which is very similar because it emerges from a collecting history in the 20th century that is very close to an artistic practice of the best exhibitions being developed by artists. In this case, it's the concentration is on pavilions. So the collection is built on artist pavilions that then house other works. So there are independent structures within a city or within a park or within a group of hectares. And those independent spaces each hold their pavilions that contain the body of work of an artist, or one architecture, which is an artwork, contains the body of work of many other artists thematically. And I love them. I love them. They are, you spend a full day, sometimes you need more days, and it is filled with pleasure. It is simple. It involves care. People take them to go meditate, meaning they go there to meditate. They go there to learn about architecture, about scientific experiments. They learn about the botanical plants, whether they're endemic or from other countries. You walk in a city or you walk to get from one to the other. So the typology of the sculpture pavilion park, in that sense, I love. I love.
This was founded by an eccentric billionaire who runs around like Jesus Christ. Yeah. So he's kind of a hippie. He could be a...
Which one do you say?
The one in Brazil, you know. With the
in Chotim, yes. They're all in some way religious. All of the founders, Sufi,
So we are still talking about a kind of eccentric, in America especially, philanthropes who have a lot of money and then suddenly understand they want to exist in the future. So it is which is an interesting phenomenon in the 19th century, and it's still going on. So I also worked for a museum which is called Ludwig, and he was a very, very, very aggressive businessman, and his motivation for business was to buy art, but he was very knowledgeable in Cuba, in all over the world. Yeah. However, I would have never gotten a job there while he was alive, absolutely not. So there was a tension, opposition. And the same with Manolo in Barcelona, right? He has a kind of a Jesuit education. He's definitely a leftist, and he's from Barcelona and not from Madrid. So there are many kind of tensions. And he's doing a wonderful job, right? And he hires good people, and he lets them do what they want.
He hires good people, and
it's very much a situation who you get together with. So his initiative with his artist friends and so on, this is fantastic. We shouldn't ask the question, how much is a museum? No, you should get a lot of money towards artists who get their brain going and get together. Maybe they can look at all the stuff in the basement. Not necessarily art historians who will just
catalog,
but say maybe there is energy, let's show it. And then maybe show it in Paris, show it in Berlin as an example of suppressed history. You see, Germany is full of that still. And now with Putin, it all comes up again, you see?
Yeah.
Helen, your favorite museums?
Sorry, I will repeat also Reina Sofia. I think it's one of the most inspiring museums since years and even a decade, because they could have slept...
Barcelona? No,
in Madrid.
In Madrid, sorry.
They could have slept on Guernica, and it was enough to welcome people and a huge amount of visitors.
But
it was the starting point, because it's speaking about... Guernica is speaking about war, about violence, about the situation dramatic in the history of Spain. And all those topics that were and that are in Guernica are the roots for a redefinition of art history and for invitation of artists, and constantly reimagining the missions of the museum, the connection between Spain and Latin America. So a lot of things are questioned inside this museum with super sharp exhibitions. And if I can make also another example, I would quote a more radical example, the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, because they
Where is
are
that?
In Eindhoven, in Netherlands. They are challenging constantly the definition of what is a museum.
What are they doing?
They are
connected to Kosovo as well. No,
Yeah. For example, maybe 1 decade ago, they invited the Cuban artist Tania Bruguera to make a project about a museum of arte utile. And she did a research with many people, about 200 examples in the recent art history of artists connected to social issues, political issues, and would try to invent art that would be connected to a community. And now they are doing a project about queering the museum. So they are always an echo chamber of what's happening in the world and trying to transform the museum, because they are aware that the museum is also a tool of power, a tool of representation. So how to deconstruct this tool of power to root it again in the community. And just to end with that, we can speak about models, but you have to invent what is a good model for you. And if you make a museum, think about the community where you build the museum, because there is nothing, a museum does not exist if it's not rooted to a community, not working with, I don't know, the social workers, with the schools, with all the people who are part of the city. And once again, I like to compare the museum to the ecosystem, because then you need to find the roots.
Again, the Van Abbe Museum was founded by an industrialist who was a very good collector and gave its collection to the city. At that time, the city didn't even wanted it. And he also suggested a very good architect. So this is a stepping point. And then people had a tradition of interesting directors.
Yeah.
And the present museum basically has an idea of a museum and goes all around the world and preaches this democratic museum. But the director himself is very rarely there. So I don't believe that there is a community in the town for that museum. It has lost its community. It's another model, but it's famous world around. But when you go there, the reality is different. So
I was just there 2 weeks ago, and it's interesting. And I had to take my nephew who was visiting me, who's a very young teenager, and I said, I have to work for the next 2 hours. Can you take a tour of the museum and so on? He's not one to visit museums. And at the end of the day, I said, how was your experience? And he said, I loved it. And I think that it does have an audience, but it's a very conceptual museum. It's very international. And it has a very radical proposal that is adored by, I would say, a lot of arts professionals. But a lot of what that museum does as well is, and it's very innovative in this, is that it has an entire experimental program to welcome audiences that have handicaps. So its program of accessibility, it's very advanced. So people that are almost blind, people that cannot hear, older people. So it's actually specialized very much within a community that's local, within the region of Eindhoven and not just the city.
So it's global,
yeah.
But the company, big electric company.
The Philips.
No.
The tobacco company.
What is the name of it? I've forgotten. Very big. Has gone. So it's also a conflict between the mentality of the town and the museum. It's now an international example. So you do not know how things are going to go. This is good.
Thank you. Unë po du me kry me një mision që tash po m'duket edhe ma fisnik që e përmene që qka ka me qenë misioni edhe synimi jotë, si me thonë, qka ndigjova është skenari minimal, qka do me bo me këtë muze të artit bashkohor, e që është që peshohun e tash dhe po du me të lutë, mos me përfundu si një prej qëtyne njerëzve që 1937 e kam themelu diçka që jo qujtë Muzeu Artit Bashkohor këtu në Kosovë, e mos ekziston. A muj minimalisht edhe na mu siguru që njerëz që sot janë gjallë që po krijojnë art fantastik në Kosovë që i përmene, e të cilët janë shumë që tanë këta duhet me qenë me rojnë në komunitetin e juj. Qëta njerë që i përmene, janë artistat e sotit, janë qaq bashkohor të Kosovës, janë qaq të ranjosën Kosovë, ki që të Petritin Halilin që i përmene, ai me dheun e runikut që është katuni vetë në Drenic, maron art edhe që një jashtë në botë. Që do më thonë, s'ka asni shaj që sështë i ranjosër në komunitetin e vetë. E ki Recep Ferin që i ka angazhu gratë që bojnë zanate me e thurë qilima edhe tapiseri që janë, do me thonë, tapiserit edhe qilimat e ti janë të marume prej grave të Kosovës, janë të eksplozume momentalisht paviljonin Venedik. Edhe një shembull sa I rënjosur është një artist I tillë bashkohor në kulturën e Kosovës, me të lutë që këta me u dokumentu, mos me përfundu nëse mujmë të kalumën me dokumentu shumë mirë, po bile tashmen, sigurohemi që ta kena në qëtë muze. Kjo është, që ky synim po më duket I thjesht, po shumë I duhun, edhe urgjent me bo me muzeon e taneshëm.
Ki shumë të drejtë, do më thonë na në qëtë moment e kemi një kësi fotografi të qysh është gjendja në Kosovë dhe çka është ndodhë në fushën e artit, e cila është e përbame prej veprës së qytetëve artistave, cilët fatkeqësisht ma shumë shihen jashtë se sa që mundën me u pa brenda. Unë e di kur kom qenë për shembull veç me plotësu që ato që the ti, kur kom shku në muzeon Pompidou në Paris, kom qenë I mrekullum kur në një prej dhomave shumë të mdhaja, kom pa ka qenë kësi bijuteri, nuk e di qysh me qujt, e cila ka qenë mblume me dheun e runikut, për mduket, edhe kur e kom pa emnin aty ka qenë Petrit Alilaj, do me thoni, cili e ka ekspozu që është të jep fragmentet të storjes ti, e kështu edhe storjes Kosovës, për mes veprave ti në për muzet ma të njoftën në botë, nëso e di ka qenë edhe Reina Sofia në Madrid rishtazi. Kështu që po pajtona plotësisht që e kemi detyrë që me kap qëtë moment edhe me gjithë këta njerëz me mujtë me bo diqka, e cila nuk është veç e tashme, po ka me pas vazhdimësi edhe në të ardhmen. Unë përsa to po besoj që misioni jonë është që mos më fokusu veç në grup njerëzve, po me mujtë me pas dialog me sa ma shumë njerëz, edhe që ato që e tha edhe herën, me mujtë, që ajo baza jonë me qenë taman në roj, do me thonë me pas roj të lëshu me thellë. Kjo është nashta mision ambicios, po është e vetëmja mënyrë që është na mujë me ndërtu një institucion cili ka me qenë jetë gjatë. Edhe që ajo është detyra jonë e domosdoshme, pra s'kemi zgjidhje tjetër, duhemi me bo, edhe kemi me bo.
Për që ato të përgëzoj që po me të është I përkushtum, vazhdo me të I përkushtum në qëtë projekt edhe në tjera që I ki bo, e kemi posa sukses me kanë qenë, por qka do që ke nevoj ka aspekti I ndimës në kryimin e atmosferës që e prezervan e run qëto qka o të bo tash, jo trashëgimi, po qka o të bo tash minimum që muj me një mu ka ona mediatike mos na kurse. Kjo ishte krejt qka kishim për sonte, vazhdoni me ashtu I kalzo.com, deri në emision e radhës mirë mbeqi.